The wind swept across the prairie, tugging at the hem of Mary Ellen's faded dress as she stood outside her small cabin. From a distance, it might have looked like any modest homestead. Weathered wood walls, a sagging porch, and a small garden struggling against the dry earth. But to the people in town, this place wasn't a home. It was a symbol of shame. And Mary Ellen, with her 5-year-old boy clinging to her skirts, was a reminder of what they called sin that bore fruit. Life had not been gentle with her. At 17, full of youthful dreams and naive trust, she had believed a man's promise of forever. But promises are light things when spoken by someone who never intended to keep them. When she found herself with child and no ring, her father's eyes had turned cold, her mother's voice sharp with disappointment. One night, after a storm of angry words, she was told to leave and never return. The weight of that rejection had nearly crushed her then, but somehow she had found strength to survive. Now, years later, she carried herself with quiet resilience. Every day was the same, tending her small patch of garden, drawing water from the well, mending clothes until her fingers ached. She worked as hard as any man might, not for pride, but for her son, little Thomas, the only soul in the world who looked at her without judgment. His laughter was her only music, his small arms her only comfort when loneliness gnawed at her. But whenever she ventured into town, the peace shattered. She felt it in the way conversations hushed when she passed, in the tight smiles that never reached the eyes of the shopkeepers, in the way other women drew their children closer as if her shame might rub off. She had grown used to the stares, yet each one left a sting, like burrs caught in her skin. On market days, she walked quickly, head bowed, hoping only to finish her errands and retreat home. She never lingered, never dared join in the chatter, outside the mercantile or the gossip near the church steps, for she knew what they said, that she had ruined herself, that no decent man would ever want a woman like her, burdened with a child who had no father. Some said worse things, whispers meant to wound, questioning her virtue, her worth, her right even to live among them. Mary Ellen pretended not to hear. But at night, when the house was quiet and her boy slept, the words would echo in her mind. No one will marry her. She is ruined. Her child will grow up with no name, no place. She pressed her face into the pillow and wept silently, afraid even of waking Thomas with her sorrow. Still, despite the hardness of life, she refused to break. Each morning she rose, braided her hair, dressed her boy, and faced the world again. There was steel in her spine, born of necessity, though her heart longed for gentler things, companionship, safety, love. She had accepted, though, that those dreams were for other women, the ones whose reputations were unblemished, whose families still welcomed them at their tables. For herself, Mary Ellen believed there would be no hand to hold hers, no warm voice to share her burdens. She had been cast aside, and society had judged her unworthy. All she could do was keep moving forward, raising her son with all the strength she could muster. And yet, deep down, in the quiet corners of her soul, a small hope flickered, a dangerous, fragile thing she dared not feed. For though the world had rejected her, a part of her still yearned for someone to look at her and see not her past, but the woman she was now. The morning sun cast a warm glow across the town square, glinting off glass windows and freshly swept wooden porches. Mary Ellen clutched a small basket in one hand, Thomas's tiny fingers in the other, as she walked toward the market. Trips into town always filled her with a knot of unease, but they were necessary. Flour, salt, and lamp oil didn't grow from the soil of her little farm. She kept her gaze low, hoping to slip in and out without drawing attention. At first, the day seemed kinder than most. She exchanged coins for sugar, offered a polite nod to the shopkeeper, and reminded Thomas to stay close by her side. The boy's Cheerful chatter about the horse tethered outside the blacksmith's shop almost made her forget the heavy air that usually lingered around her. Almost. But then came the voices. It began as a murmur from across the mercantile, a pair of women standing near the bolts of cloth. Their words carried farther than they realized, or perhaps they wanted her to hear. "Poor boy," one woman whispered, her tone sharp with pity wrapped in disdain. "He'll grow up with no proper name, no father to guide him." The other laughed softly, a cruel sound. "And her? She's a fool to think anyone would take her now. A woman with a child and no husband. Used up, that's what she is." Mary Ellen froze, her back stiffening. Her fingers tightened around Thomas's hand, though she kept her face still, pretending she hadn't heard. She had learned to walk past insults, to let them slide off her like dust on her boots. But the words dug deep all the same, sharp and unrelenting. She made for the door quickly, but another voice rang out, this time from a group of men lounging near the hitching post. "Best she learned to live alone," one drawled, tipping his hat back. "Ain't no man willing to raise another man's mistake." The men laughed, a harsh chorus that burned in her ears. Thomas tugged at her sleeve, puzzled. "Mama, why are they laughing?" Her throat tightened. She forced a smile down at him, masking the storm that raged inside. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Let's hurry home." But the laughter followed her down the street, and the women's whispers seemed to cling to her like burrs she couldn't shake off. Each step felt heavier, her cheeks burning though she kept her head bowed. She didn't cry, not in front of them. She would not give them that satisfaction. When she reached the edge of town, the noise fell behind her, replaced by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady crunch of gravel underfoot. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, though her chest still ached with the weight of humiliation. By the time she and Thomas reached their cabin, she had composed herself again. She set the basket down, took a steadying breath, and crouched to face her boy. "Thomas," she said softly, brushing the curls from his forehead. "People say things sometimes, unkind things, but that doesn't make them true. You are not a mistake. You are my blessing." The boy's innocent eyes searched hers, unclouded by the cruelty of the world. He smiled and wrapped his arms around her neck, and for a moment all the whispers and laughter melted away. His embrace reminded her why she endured the shame, why she kept her head high despite the sting of words. Still, as she held him close, Mary Ellen could not silence the echo of those voices. No man would take her. She was ruined. It was a reminder. She hadn't asked for, yet one she could never fully escape. The dust of late afternoon rolled across the main road leading into town, stirred up by the steady rhythm of hooves. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette framed by the golden glow of the sinking sun. The townsfolk gathered near the saloon or finishing up their day's errands turned their heads to watch as the stranger rode in. He was a cowboy in every sense of the word, broad-shouldered, lean from long days in the saddle, his face bronzed by sun and wind. His hat was pulled low, shadowing sharp eyes that missed little, and a worn duster coat clung to him like a second skin. His horse, a dark bay with powerful legs, moved with the ease of a creature long accustomed to the trail. His name was Luke Carter, though few here knew it yet. For years he had drifted between ranches and cattle drives, working where he was needed, staying nowhere too long. He had earned a reputation among men on the trail as fair, steady, and not easily provoked. But he carried a quiet sadness in him, too, the kind that made him keep his distance from most folks. Luke dismounted outside the general store, tying his horse with practiced hands. He stepped inside, nodding politely to the shopkeeper, who eyed him with the kind of curiosity small towns always held for strangers. He bought supplies, a sack of flour, a coil of rope, and some coffee beans, and listened more than he spoke. And it was while he listened that he first heard her name, Mary Ellen. Two women at the counter were whispering, not bothering to lower their voices much. "That poor fool was in again this morning with that boy of hers. You'd think she'd have the sense to stay home, but no, she parades her shame for all to see." Luke frowned slightly, though he kept his eyes on the shelf of lantern oil. He had passed enough towns in his life to recognize the tone. Cruelty disguised as righteousness, gossip sharpened into a weapon. He didn't know who Mary Ellen was, but already he felt a flicker of unease at how casually they spoke of her. Later, as he stepped back into the street, he caught sight of her for the first time. She was walking briskly, her son's hand tucked firmly in hers, a basket hanging from her other arm. Her hair, dark and braided neatly, caught the light, and though her dress was plain, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Yet there was no mistaking the way the crowd's eyes followed her, some with disdain, others with pity. She moved as though she were used to it, shoulders squared, face set, though he could see a weariness there too, an exhaustion deeper than physical labor. Luke watched as a man muttered something under his breath when she passed. Her jaw tightened, but she kept walking, her little boy trotting to keep up. Something in that moment stirred in Luke, not pity but recognition. He knew what it was to be judged, to be spoken of without kindness, to carry burdens that others never cared to understand. He asked quietly at the saloon later that evening, and the bartender confirmed what the gossip had hinted at. Girl had a child out of wedlock years back. Family cast her out, but she's stubborn. Works that little patch of land, raises the boy on her own. Folks don't take kindly to her, but she doesn't bow her head either. Luke sipped his drink and said nothing, but his eyes drifted toward the window to where the last traces of daylight slipped behind the rooftops. A woman raising a child alone, working the land with no help, bearing the weight of scorn, that was no small thing. Something told him he would be seeing more of Mary Ellen. The next morning dawned bright and cool, the prairie grass still beaded with dew. Mary Ellen was already outside, sleeves rolled up, working on the wagon that leaned lopsided in front of her cabin. The left wheel had split under the weight of a heavy load of firewood, and though she had managed to drag it home, repairing it alone was proving a harder task than she'd expected. Thomas sat nearby on the porch steps, kicking his small boots against the wood while he played with a carved horse. "Mama," he called, "why don't we ask Mr. Henderson from town to help?" Mary Ellen shook her head firmly. "No, darling. We don't trouble folks unless we must." She didn't add the words, and most wouldn't help us anyway. Years of cold shoulders and turned backs had taught her not to expect kindness. She braced her shoulder against the wheel, trying to wedge it back into place, when the sound of hoofbeats approached. Startled, she straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. A rider came into view, a man on a dark bay horse, sitting tall in the saddle, reins loose in one hand. It was the cowboy she had glimpsed in town the day before, though she hadn't noticed then how his eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp and steady, taking in every detail without a word. He slowed as he drew near, tipping his hat politely. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a voice calm and even, touched with the gravel of the trail. His gaze flicked to the wagon. "Looks like you've got yourself a bit of trouble." Mary Ellen stiffened, wary of strangers, especially men. "Nothing I can't manage," she replied, though the ache in her arms betrayed her struggle. The cowboy dismounted, tying his horse loosely to the fence post. "No offense meant, but I've fixed a fair share of wagon wheels. Might go easier with 2 sets of hands." Before she could refuse, Thomas piped up eagerly, "Mama, let him help! He's got a horse!" The boy's eyes shone with excitement, already forgetting his carved toy as he studied the cowboy's bay gelding. Mary Ellen's lips parted to protest, but she caught the warmth in her son's face, so rare these days when the world was often unkind. Reluctantly, she nodded. "All right, just this once." The cowboy knelt beside the wheel, inspecting it with practiced hands. "Name's Luke," he said casually as he worked. "Been riding north looking for steady work." "Mary Ellen," she answered curtly, not offering more. But Thomas was less guarded. "I'm Thomas," the boy declared proudly, edging closer to Luke. "Your horse is big. Can I pet him?" Luke glanced at Mary Ellen, who hesitated before giving a small nod. The cowboy smiled faintly, then showed Thomas how to hold out his hand flat so the horse could sniff it. The boy giggled as the gelding's soft muzzle brushed his palm. Meanwhile, Luke set his shoulder against the wheel, bracing it while Mary Ellen guided the wooden peg back into place. They worked in silence, but it was not the strained silence she so often endured in town. There was no judgment in his eyes, only steady patience, as though helping her was as natural as drawing breath. When the job was done, she dusted her hands on her apron. "Thank you," she said softly, more than just for the wagon. For a moment, she almost felt seen, not as a woman marked by shame, but simply as herself. Luke tipped his hat again. "Any time, ma'am." He mounted his horse with ease, and with a last nod to Thomas, he rode off down the road, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the morning air. Mary Ellen watched him go, unsettled. She told herself it was nothing, a passing kindness from a stranger. Yet deep down, she wondered if fate had just shifted, ever so slightly, in her favor. A week passed after the cowboy's visit, and Mary Ellen tried to push him from her mind. Men came and went in towns like these, and it did her no good to imagine kindness lingering where it did not belong. Still, she caught Thomas talking often about the man with the horse, his eyes bright whenever he remembered. The way Luke had let him feed the gelding a handful of grass. So when Luke appeared again one late afternoon, riding up the lane with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the open trail, Mary Ellen felt her chest tighten. She had just pulled the last loaf of bread from the small brick oven outside, its warm scent filling the air. She straightened quickly, brushing flour from her hands, and met him at the fence. "You again?" she said, trying to sound neutral. Luke tipped his hat. "Me again. Hope you don't mind. I was headed this way anyhow." He glanced toward the garden where weeds threatened the neat rows of beans. "Figured maybe I could lend a hand if you'd allow it." Her first instinct was to refuse. Help always came with expectations, favors owed, reputations ruined further. But Thomas barreled out the door, barefoot and smiling. "Luke!" he shouted, rushing toward the fence. The boy's delight disarmed her better than any argument could, so she let him stay. They worked side by side in the garden, pulling weeds, staking drooping plants. For a long while, there was only the sound of rustling leaves, the creak of the fence, and Thomas humming as he pretended to plow furrows with a stick. Luke didn't press her with questions, and his silence was oddly comforting. At last, when the sun dipped low and the air cooled, she found herself speaking words she had never meant to share. "You should know," she began, her voice low. "Folks in town don't speak kindly about me." Luke leaned against the fence post, calm as ever. "I noticed," her lips pressed together. She hadn't expected honesty. "They think I am ruined, that no decent man would have me, and perhaps they're right." She lifted her chin, though her throat ached. "I have a child. His father left before Thomas was even born. My family cast me out. Since then, I've had to manage on my own. Some days I wonder if there's a mark on my forehead the whole world can see." The words came out sharper than she intended, laced with bitterness. She braced herself for his reaction. Pity, judgment, or worse, that false kindness men sometimes used before walking away. But Luke said nothing at first. He only watched her, his eyes steady, unreadable. Then he spoke, voice quiet but certain. "Raising a boy alone, keeping this place running, doesn't sound ruined to me. Sounds like strength most wouldn't understand." Mary Ellen blinked, taken aback. No one had ever spoken of her life in those terms. To most, she was a cautionary tale, not a figure of strength. Her laugh came brittle. "You don't know what it's like being the subject of every whisper. Some days I can't walk through town without wanting the ground to swallow me whole." Luke's gaze softened then, a flicker of something almost vulnerable in his own expression. "I know more about whispers than you think. Folks talk about anyone who doesn't fit their mold. Best lesson I ever learned on the trail is this: their words don't change the truth of who you are." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Thomas ran up then, clutching a handful of beans, proud of his harvest. Luke bent to listen as the boy chattered, but Mary Ellen's eyes lingered on him, unsettled by how easily he had seen through her defenses. For the first time in years, she had told the truth of her shame out loud, And for the first time, someone had answered not with judgment, but respect. It didn't take long for tongues to wag. In a town as small as theirs, a man couldn't so much as tie his horse at the wrong hitching post without someone making a story of it. By the end of the week, the story of Luke Carter visiting Mary Ellen's cabin had already spread through every corner of town. At the Mercantile, women lowered their voices, but not enough to keep her from hearing. "Did you see him ride out that way again? She snared another one, mark my words." As if any respectable man would want to raise another's brat. "He'll wise up soon enough." Mary Ellen kept her eyes fixed on the bolts of calico she was pretending to consider, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the fabric. She wanted to scream at them, tell them Luke had come by only to lend a hand, that nothing improper had passed between them. But she had learned years ago that defending herself only fanned the flames. The gossips weren't the only ones whispering. A few men by the saloon door made cruder remarks, laughter sharp as a whip. "That cowboy'll regret wasting his time there. A woman like her doesn't change. You'll see." Mary Ellen's cheeks burned, and she hurried through her errands, dragging Thomas along before the boy could ask too many questions. Back at the cabin, she scrubbed the table harder than necessary, her thoughts a tangled storm. She had been managing well enough before Luke came along. Now his presence threatened to undo the fragile balance she had built. If the town believed something improper was happening, it would only deepen her isolation. When Luke rode up that evening, she met him on the porch with her arms folded tight across her chest. "You shouldn't come here anymore," she said firmly, before he could even greet her. His brows drew together beneath the brim of his hat. "Something wrong?" "Everything," she snapped, then softened when she saw Thomas poke his head out the window, eyes wide with confusion. Lowering her voice, she added, "They're talking, Luke, in town. About you, about me. I can't have that. My son's already growing up with too many stares and whispers. I won't give them more to say." Luke studied her in silence for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he said quietly, "Do their words matter so much?" Her laugh was bitter. "Of course they matter. Words can starve a person worse than hunger. They can make doors close, make people turn away when you most need help. I've lived under the weight of them for years." Her eyes shone with unshed tears, though she fought them back. "I can't let Thomas carry that burden too." Luke stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "Seems to me you've been carrying it all alone already." "You shouldn't have to." The simplicity of the words nearly undid her. For a heartbeat, she wanted nothing more than to lean against him, to let someone else shoulder the weight. But fear pulled her back. Dependence had broken her once before. She would not let it happen again. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It's safer if you stay away." Luke tipped his hat, eyes lingering on her face, then swung into the saddle. "I'll respect what you ask," he said, though his tone carried a note of quiet resolve. "But don't mistake silence for agreement. Folks talk because they see something they don't understand. Let 'em. Doesn't change the truth." He turned his horse and rode off into the gathering dusk, leaving her on the porch with her heart hammering. Mary Ellen wrapped her arms around herself, shivering though the air was still warm. She told herself she had done the right thing, protecting her boy, shielding what little peace they had. And yet deep inside, a small part of her grieved the loss of his steady presence, the rare comfort she had begun to trust. The gossips had won again, for now. Luke Carter was a man who had spent most of his life on the move. The trail taught him plenty: how to mend leather with nothing but a needle and patience, how to sleep beneath the stars through rain and wind, and most of all, how to ignore the noise of other men. Cattle hands always talked, boasting, mocking, spinning half-truths over campfires, but Luke had learned to weigh a person by their actions, not the words thrown around behind their back. So when the town began its whispering campaign about Mary Ellen, he wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was how much those words stirred something in him. Normally, he would have shrugged and ridden on, leaving gossip to those who fed on it. But this time he found himself restless, haunted by the image of her standing on that porch, shoulders squared, eyes fierce with the weight of a burden she should never have carried alone. He spent the next few days at a nearby ranch. offering his skill with horses in exchange for coin and a bed of straw in the barn. By day he worked, but by night his thoughts wandered back to her, the tired set of her mouth, the steel in her spine, and the way her little boy's hand had slipped so easily into his when he'd shown him the horse. There was a tenderness there between mother and child that spoke of loyalty, endurance, and love stronger than any gossip could stain. One evening, as he rubbed down the bay gelding, the ranch owner's wife appeared at the barn door, curiosity plain on her face. "They say you've been keeping company with Mary Ellen," she said, not unkindly, but with the same cautious tone everyone seemed to use when her name was mentioned. Luke met her gaze evenly. "I've spoken with her, yes," the woman pursed her lips. "She's had a hard road. Folks don't forget what they want to remember. But between you and me, that girl's stronger than half the men in this town." Her words only sharpened the truth already burning in him. He didn't care for gossip. He cared for what he'd seen. A woman doing everything in her power to raise her son with dignity, even when the world wanted to grind her down. By the next morning, his mind was made up. He saddled his horse and rode back toward her cabin. As he approached, he saw her in the yard, hanging laundry on the line. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, but her face was turned away, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she were anywhere but here. Thomas was nearby, chasing a chicken with peals of laughter that warmed the air. Luke dismounted quietly and leaned against the fence, watching for a moment before speaking. "You told me to stay away," he said evenly. Mary Ellen stiffened, a clothespin falling from her fingers. "I meant it." "I know." He paused, voice steady. "But I'm not the kind of man who walks away because of what people say. I've seen enough of life to know their words don't define you." She turned then, eyes flashing. "You don't understand. Their words do define me. Every door is shut. Every kindness is withheld. You can ride on and leave it behind, but I live with it every day." Luke stepped closer, his hand resting on the top rail of the fence. "And yet you keep going." "That's what I see, Mary Ellen. Not shame. Not weakness. Strength. You've built a life out here with nothing but your own two hands. You've raised a boy who looks at the world with laughter instead of bitterness. That's no small thing." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Thomas's giggles. Mary Ellen's throat worked, her eyes bright though no tears fell. "Why would you say such things to me?" she whispered, her voice raw. Luke's gaze softened, though his tone carried quiet conviction. "Because they're true, and because I don't intend to let gossip decide what kind of man I'll be or who I'll care for." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Mary Ellen turned away, overwhelmed, but her hands trembled as she reached for another sheet. Something inside her had shifted, though she dared not name it. Luke knew then his decision was made. He would not walk away. The church bell rang early that Sunday, its deep toll echoing across the fields and pulling families toward town. Twice a month, the congregation held a social after-service, a chance for folks to share food, exchange news, and, in truth, to measure one another by whatever unseen standards the community clung to. Mary Ellen rarely attended. She hated the sidelong looks, the whispered judgments, the way her presence seemed to darken a room. But Thomas begged her that morning, pleading for the chance to play with the other children. "We don't have to stay long," she told him as she buttoned his cleanest shirt, patched neatly at the elbow. She wore her plain blue dress, the one that fit a little snugger at the waist now from years of mending. She told herself she would endure it for his sake. The churchyard was already bustling when they arrived. Women carried baskets of bread and pies, men clustered near the wagons, children darted between legs with shouts of laughter. Conversations faltered briefly when Mary Ellen walked through the gate. She kept her chin high, one hand on Thomas's shoulder, but her stomach churned. She found a quiet corner near the food tables, arranging the loaf she had brought as if it might distract from her discomfort. Thomas was quickly swept away by a group of boys, his laughter ringing out as they ran toward the pasture fence. For a moment she allowed herself a smile, until she caught sight of the cluster of women nearby, their heads bent together, eyes flicking toward her. She shouldn't bring that boy here, one murmured, loud enough for Mary Ellen to hear. Bad example. Mary Ellen's throat tightened. She considered leaving right then, sparing herself the humiliation. But before she could move, a stir went through the crowd. Heads turned toward the road, where a tall figure on horseback approached, Luke Carter. He rode in with the easy grace of a man at home anywhere, his duster clean, his hat tipped low against the sun. Conversations paused as he dismounted, leading his bay gelding to the hitching post. Strangers always drew attention, but Luke had been in town long enough now that people whispered about him too, especially about where he spent his time. Mary Ellen's heart thudded painfully. Why did he have to come here of all days? Luke spotted her almost immediately. With a slow, deliberate stride, he crossed the yard. The murmurs rose like wind through dry grass, every eye watching. Mary Ellen's breath caught, part dread, part something else she dared not name. "Afternoon, ma'am," Luke greeted, his voice calm and warm. He looked at her as though no one else existed. "Mind if I stand here a spell?" Heat flooded her cheeks. She wanted to shoo him away, to protect him from the gossips circling like buzzards. But her voice stuck. Instead, she gave a stiff nod. Luke didn't seem bothered by the attention. He filled a plate from the table, asked Thomas about his adventures with the other boys, and spoke to Mary Ellen in an easy tone, as though they were simply neighbors catching up. Each word, each gesture, was a quiet defiance of the whispers hissing all around them. Some faces hardened with disapproval. Others looked on with open curiosity. The minister's wife pursed her lips, whispering to her husband, who frowned deeply. The air felt charged, as if the whole town were holding its breath, waiting for some scandal to unfold. Mary Ellen's chest tightened with the urge to flee. But then she glanced at Thomas, his eyes bright, his laughter free, and she realized that leaving would only confirm the whispers. For his sake, she forced herself to stay, though her hands shook where they clutched her skirt. And Luke, he stood beside her like an oak tree planted firm in the earth, steady and unyielding. His presence was a shield she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. For the first time in years, she wasn't entirely alone in the crowd. The church social buzzed like a hive, but beneath the surface it was more tension than joy. People weren't just eating bread and pie, they were watching Mary Ellen stand at the edge of the gathering with Luke Carter at her side. Watching Thomas dart in and out of the crowd, his laughter carrying like sunlight through storm clouds. Watching, whispering, waiting. Mary Ellen felt the weight of every glance. Her hands trembled around the plate she held and her cheeks burned. She kept telling herself she needed to leave. But Luke stood beside her so calmly, as if nothing about the moment was unusual. It steadied her. His presence was a kind of defiance in itself, though she feared what it might cost him. Then came the minister's voice calling for quiet. "Brothers and sisters, let us give thanks for food, for fellowship, and for the good Lord who provides." Heads bowed, murmurs of amen rose, and the moment stretched. But when the prayer ended, it didn't return to normal chatter. Instead, there was a pause, an expectant silence. The crowd's eyes drifted back to Luke and Mary Ellen as though everyone sensed something was about to break, and they were right. Luke cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying easily over the yard. "I reckon there's something I ought to say." Mary Ellen's head jerked up. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What is he doing? All at once, the buzz of conversation died. Children stilled mid-play. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men narrowed their eyes. The hush was so complete, Mary Ellen could hear the faint creak of the laundry line rope shifting in the wind. Luke's gaze swept the crowd, unflinching. "I've heard the talk since I rode into this town. I've heard the way some of you speak about Mary Ellen." His tone was measured, not angry, but it cut sharper than a blade. "You call her names. You act as though she's done wrong, when the only wrong I see is how you've treated her." Gasps rippled, a murmur of protest here, a stiff silence there. Mary Ellen's face burned hot enough she thought she might faint. "Luke," she whispered, but he pressed on. "She's worked harder than most men I've known. She's raised a boy with nothing but her own 2 hands and her own grit. And she's done it with dignity, despite how this town has turned its back on her." Thomas, sensing something important, crept back toward his mother, clutching her skirts. His wide eyes fixed on Luke, shining with unspoken hope. Luke looked down at them both, and for a moment his voice softened. "And I'll tell you plain, I've seen enough of the world to know what matters, and what matters is standing beside people worth standing for." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small velvet pouch. Dusty from travel, worn at the seams, but inside it was a ring, a simple band of silver set with a modest stone. He turned to Mary Ellen, his dark eyes steady, his face open. "Mary Ellen Harper," he said, clear enough for every ear to hear. "I ain't asking you in secret, and I don't care who disapproves. Will you marry me? Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to Thomas? Will you let me prove that love don't bow to gossip?" The world seemed to stop. Mary Ellen's knees nearly gave way beneath her. The ring sparkled faintly in his calloused palm, but what undid her was not the silver. It was the courage, the kindness, the unwavering strength in his voice. The crowd broke into chaos, half shocked whispers, half angry mutters, and a few scattered sighs of wonder. The minister's wife clutched her pearls. A rancher shook his head. But Mary Ellen saw none of it. All she saw was Luke, standing firm, offering her a place in the light after so many years in the shadows. Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak at first, not over the roar in her ears. But Thomas tugged at her hand, whispering softly, "Say yes, Mama." Her eyes filled, the dam breaking. She pressed her lips together, then finally managed to nod, her voice raw but sure. "Yes, Luke. Yes." And just like that, the hush shattered into something new. For a long moment after Mary Ellen's trembling yes, the churchyard seemed caught between 2 worlds, the old one filled with whispers and judgment, and the new one sparked by Luke Carter's boldness. The crowd buzzed with shock and disbelief, but beneath it all was something else, something undeniable. Change. Luke slipped the simple silver band onto Mary Ellen's finger with steady hands. His eyes never left hers, even as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The stone glinted in the afternoon sun, but it was his gaze, honest, unwavering, that rooted her to the spot. For years, she had braced herself against loneliness, convinced that no one would ever see her as anything more than damaged, cast off, unwanted. Yet here he was, standing tall before the town, declaring her worthy of love. Thomas grinned so wide his cheeks hurt, clapping his small hands. "Mama's getting married!" he shouted, his little voice ringing out. Some of the children laughed and joined in, while their parents silenced them with sharp looks. But the sound of it, the innocence, the joy, felt like a blessing. Mary Ellen's cheeks flushed hot, but for once it wasn't with shame. Tears blurred her vision as Luke bent his head and whispered, meant only for her, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." The minister cleared his throat, clearly unsettled. "This is highly irregular," he began, but Luke's glance cut him short. Not hostile, not disrespectful, just unyielding. A quiet message that there would be no undoing what had been spoken. Some left in a huff, skirts swishing, boots stomping. Others lingered, curiosity softening into something more like reflection. A few even offered tentative smiles. But none of that mattered to Mary Ellen anymore. For the first time in years, she felt lighter, as though the chains of other people's opinions no longer bound her. That night, back at her cabin, the stars burned bright across the velvet sky. Thomas had fallen asleep early, worn out from the excitement, his small body curled on his pallet by the fire. Mary Ellen sat on the porch with Luke, the ring catching moonlight as she turned it nervously on her finger. I don't know how to do this, she admitted softly. I've spent so long just surviving. Luke reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently. Then we'll figure it out together. I've been on the trail half my life, chasing cattle and chasing pay. Truth is, I've been surviving too. Maybe it's time we both learned to live. His words settled into her like a seed into good soil, quiet but full of promise. In the weeks that followed, gossip didn't vanish overnight. There were still whispers, still judgment from those unwilling to let go of their scorn. But others began to see differently. They saw Luke repairing the fence line beside Thomas, treating the boy as his own. They saw Mary Ellen walk through town with her head higher, no longer shrinking into shadows. And slowly, grudgingly, the whispers lost their power. The day of their small wedding, the sky was wide and blue. No grand procession, no elaborate feast. Just vows spoken under the open heavens with a handful of neighbors who chose kindness over cruelty. Thomas stood between them, his little hand in theirs, his grin brighter than the sun. When Luke kissed Mary Ellen's forehead, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, her heart wasn't heavy with fear of tomorrow. It was full of hope, full of belonging, full of love she had once thought forever out of reach. And though life would still be hard, fields to plow, storms to weather, mouths to feed, she knew now she wouldn't face it alone. Mary Ellen Harper, once certain no man would ever have her, had become Mary Ellen Carter, wife to a cowboy who had silenced a town with nothing more than his truth. And as she looked at Luke and at Thomas, she understood. This was not just survival anymore. This was a new beginning.